The wind that moved across the Eurotas Valley carried no softness, no scent of flowers or comfort. It was a wind of dust and iron, whispering through the olive groves like a reminder that mercy was a foreign word here. In the heart of Laconia, beneath the shadow of Mount Taygetus, a city was built not for beauty, not for art, not even for glory, but for endurance. Sparta was not born from dreamers or poets. It was engineered line by line, like a weapon being forged in the hands of necessity. Its people believed that the world itself was cruel, and that only the cruel could survive it. They did not pray for peace because peace softened. They did not celebrate love because love distracted. Instead, they built their laws upon blood, upon the belief that the state, not the individual, was sacred, and that every heartbeat, every birth, every union existed for one purpose: to strengthen the body of Sparta. From the moment a child was conceived, it was no longer private, no longer personal. Desire was irrelevant. Marriage was a transaction between muscle and lineage. The gods were invoked, yes, but not to bless love, to bless function. The Council of Elders decided who could marry whom, their judgments based on symmetry of bone, on the width of shoulders, on the promise of children who might run faster, fight longer, die slower. If the woman was strong, she was considered beautiful. If she was weak, she was invisible. This was not cruelty, they said. It was purity. The Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus, part myth, part architect of the impossible, had written it long ago in words that were less commandment and more prophecy. Let the state shape its people as the potter shapes his clay. For the weak pot cracks and the strong endures. Those words were repeated through generations like prayer, until belief turned to instinct. And in that instinct lay the foundation of a civilization that sought to breed not men, but embodiments of endurance itself. The houses of Sparta were plain, almost identical. There was no marble, no painted frescoes, no gilded halls. Excess was sin because it distracted the mind from duty. Spartan wealth was not measured in gold or land, it was measured in discipline. A man who ate too well, who spoke too freely, who desired too much, was considered diseased. Freedom in this city of warriors was a form of weakness. And yet, there was a kind of purity in that austerity. Every object had purpose. Every movement had control. When the women walked through the marketplace, their steps were steady, their gazes direct. They were not veiled or hidden like those in other Greek cities. They were expected to be bold, to speak, to command. Because the state needed strong mothers, the womb was a weapon as sacred as the spear. There were rituals for conception, quiet, controlled, almost scientific. Men were advised to visit their wives sparingly to avoid exhaustion, to preserve the vitality of their seed. Love was not forbidden, only irrelevant. A Spartan couple might share a bed for the first time not on their wedding night, but months or even years later, in secrecy, as if indulging a forbidden luxury. To be seen as too affectionate was to invite suspicion. Emotion was disorder, and disorder was death. In this strange world, tenderness was treason. The law of blood demanded sacrifice not just from the body, but from the heart. A Spartan belonged not to his family, but to the polis. His wife's children were not her own, they were property of the state. The milk she fed them, the songs she sang, the discipline she taught, all of it was service, not affection. Even motherhood was militarized. When a boy was born, the mother's first prayer was not for his happiness, but for his endurance. May he never fear. That was the closest a Spartan woman came to saying, "I love you." It was a love that existed through the blade, not the embrace. The priests said Sparta was chosen by the gods for its purity of purpose. The philosophers of Athens mocked this. They called it barbarism disguised as virtue, but they misunderstood what Sparta truly was. It was not ignorance, it was devotion taken to its final, merciless form. The Spartans did not seek pleasure because pleasure could not survive war. They did not write poetry because beauty distracted from discipline. They did not build empires because empire required compromise. They built themselves. They became the empire of flesh. Each man was a wall, each woman a foundation, and together they were the fortress. The elders who governed the city, white-haired men carved from the same granite as the hills, were the guardians of this purity. Their word was absolute, their vision unquestioned. They enforced laws that reached into the most private corners of life. To eat alone was selfishness. To speak unnecessarily was vanity. To fail to endure pain without sound was disgrace. In their silence and their uniformity, they believed they had found the closest thing to divine order that humanity could achieve. But order, purchased at the price of soul, carries a cost. There were whispers even then among the helots, the enslaved class who worked the fields and bore the weight of Spartan glory, that the masters' hearts had turned to stone. They said the Spartans could no longer dream, that their gods had grown silent because prayer itself had become mechanical. But to the Spartans, this was strength. They mistook numbness for control, emptiness for virtue. When the sun set over the Taygetus, the city turned red, every rooftop bathed in the color of dried blood. It was said that the god Ares smiled upon that sight, proud of his chosen people. But perhaps the smile was pity, for beneath that crimson glow, Sparta was already beginning to devour itself, one law, one sacrifice at a time. They called it discipline. But it was something older, something far more terrible. The ancient human hunger to dominate even nature itself. And nature, patient as stone, was watching. Because every law built on blood eventually feeds on the blood that created it. And in the stillness of that perfect order, in the rigid silence of a people who had traded love for survival, the first cracks began to form, small as breath, invisible as thought. They would not see it for generations. But the beginning of every end is always disguised as virtue. The dawn over Laconia was pale and indifferent, a thin wash of light that made the mountains look like the bones of the earth. The city of Sparta stirred beneath it, not with laughter or song, but with discipline. Every sound was measured, every motion restrained. And somewhere within the stone courtyards of the city, another cry joined the morning air. The cry of a newborn child. But this was not a sound of celebration. In Sparta, birth was not the beginning of life. It was the beginning of judgment. The midwives knew their roles well. They did not coo or whisper comfort to the mother. They did not praise the gods or wrap the child in warm cloth. Their hands were precise, trained, and cold. They examined the infant with a kind of sacred detachment. The length of limbs, the clarity of breath, the symmetry of the skull, a single flaw, a weakness of form or sound, and the ritual began. The mother was not permitted to speak. Her love was irrelevant. Her fear, her pain, her hope, all of it was swallowed by the law. She knew that her tears could not save what the council would condemn. She was a Spartan woman, and Spartan women did not weep where others could see. When the inspection was complete, the elder midwife would nod, and a servant would carry the child not to a cradle, but to the council of elders. There, in the open air before the temple of Apollo, the infant was laid upon a flat stone, naked and trembling beneath the morning sun. The elders gathered in silence, their faces like weathered granite. They looked not with pity, but with purpose. If the child was strong, if the cry was sharp and full, if the limbs moved with vigor, they would nod once, and the child would be returned to its mother to be raised for the state. But if the cry was weak, if the breath stuttered, if the limbs faltered, then the verdict came in a single word that ended the world before it began: unfit. And with that word, the life was no longer human. It became a lesson, a ritual offering to the god of survival. The chosen servants would take the child to Mount Taygetus, to a ravine known as the Apothete, the place of rejection. There, they would leave the infant upon the stones. The wind at Taygetus was sharp, unkind, the kind of wind that stripped sound from the throat. Those who carried the children rarely spoke. They did not look down once the deed was done. The mountains had become accustomed to such offerings. Over time, they grew heavy with silence. The philosopher Plutarch, writing centuries later, would describe it in words that still shudder with restraint. They did not destroy the weak out of cruelty, but from a belief that life unfit for service was a burden to all. He sought to explain it as philosophy, but philosophy, when soaked in blood, becomes superstition. The Spartans believed this ritual purified the state, that every cry silenced beneath the mountain was a prayer answered for the strength of those who remained. They did not think of themselves as killers. They thought of themselves as gardeners, pruning the tree of life so that it might grow straighter, taller, stronger. In their world, mercy was the truest form of cruelty, and cruelty, when sanctified by purpose, became mercy. The women of Sparta lived with this law in their bones. They were told from childhood that to bear a weak child was shame, that the gods themselves turned their faces from softness. Some whispered their prayers differently at night, quiet, trembling invocations to Artemis, goddess of childbirth, asking her to grant strength to their unborn or spare them the pain of weakness. But prayer was not rebellion, it was resignation. The law would not change, and yet, beneath that obedience, there lived a quiet grief, a grief too ancient to name. It passed from mother to mother in glances, in silences, in the way their hands hesitated when touching the roundness of their own bellies. It was a grief that could not be spoken aloud because words gave shape to rebellion, and rebellion was treason. Once, in the year 412 BCE, a Spartan midwife, her name lost to history, refused the council's order. The infant had been born frail, too small to breathe well, but she saw a spark in its eyes and could not bear to leave it to die. She hid the child in the countryside, giving it to a Helot family, one of the enslaved farmers bound to Spartan land. The child survived. When the secret was discovered years later, the midwife was executed. Her final words were said to have been, "The gods will not remember the strong, only the loved." No record mentions her name. Only the echo of her defiance remains. The law of blood was not merely a decree. It was a ritual of purification that defined the rhythm of the Spartan soul. To the state, every death was a form of maintenance, an act of control over the chaos of nature. They had taken the wild, unpredictable force of human birth and tamed it into bureaucracy. And in that taming, they believed they had conquered fate. But the cost was invisible, the corrosion of empathy, the quiet extinction of tenderness. A civilization that kills its weakest children must inevitably kill its gentlest instincts as well. In time, even the mountains began to turn against them. Travelers passing near Taygetus spoke of strange cries carried by the wind. At night, not the sound of wolves or storms, but something softer, more human. The shepherds avoided the ravine, calling it cursed ground. The Spartans, of course, dismissed such superstition. But sometimes, when a mother stood on her balcony at dawn, She could swear she heard a faint cry rising from the hills, and her heart, though trained to be silent, would tremble. Historians later debated whether the practice was as widespread as legend claimed. Some argued that the tales of the apothetae were exaggerated, that only a few children were ever truly abandoned. But truth in Sparta was not measured by numbers, and it was measured by belief. The myth itself was law, and the fear of its enforcement shaped every womb in Laconia. For generations the system worked. The children who survived were hard, resilient, silent. They grew without softness, without dependence, without tears. They were the chosen ones, the living proof that the law of blood was righteous. But beneath that perfection lay a rot that no law could cure. Because when you raise a nation that fears weakness more than death, you create a people who cannot forgive, not others, and not themselves. And so, while the mountains kept their secret graves, the city below continued to build itself upon that silence. Each birth was another offering to the ideal of strength. Each death was a vow renewed. The blood of infants had watered the soil of Sparta, and from that soil would grow a generation of warriors who knew no mercy because they had been born into a world where mercy was never shown to them. They would call themselves the sons of discipline, the guardians of virtue. But the wind that swept across the hills of Taygetus would remember differently. It would remember the cries. It would remember the mothers who turned their faces away. And though centuries would pass and Sparta would crumble into legend, that wind would never quite lose the sound. It would whisper still to those who stood in the ruins at dawn, a question as old as civilization itself. How much strength does a people gain when they trade away their soul to have it? The year was 498 BCE, and the morning mist clung to the Eurotas River like a breath that refused to lift. In the pale light, the city of Sparta stood silent, a geometry of stone and discipline. It was the season of partings. All across Laconia, mothers prepared their sons for the moment when the state would claim them. For at the age of 7, a Spartan boy ceased to belong to his family. He became property of the polis, a seed offered to the soil of discipline to be reshaped into something colder, purer, harder than flesh. There were no tears. There could be none. The mothers had been trained for this moment since girlhood. They did not kneel. They did not hold their sons too long. They placed a hand upon the child's head, whispered the words, "With your shield or on it," and turned away before the boy could see the tremor in their eyes. To show grief was to insult the gods of strength. And so they walked back into their homes, empty-handed but upright, as the boys were marched away in single file toward the barracks, their small feet sinking into the dust of a destiny already written, the Agogge, the forge of Sparta. Its walls were not tall, but they held the power to unmake everything human in those who entered. There, the boys learned the first lesson, that hunger was not to be feared, but befriended. They were fed little coarse barley bread, black broth, a few figs. If they wanted more, they were told to steal. But if they were caught, it was not the theft that was punished, it was the failure. The lesson was not morality, but cunning. A Spartan who could not take what he needed without being seen was not fit to live. At night, they lay side by side on mats woven from reeds they had cut themselves. No blankets, no fire. The cold was a teacher, the dark was a companion. From the beginning, comfort was an enemy to be conquered. Each day began with silence. The instructors, men hardened by war, spoke little. When they did, their voices were low and measured, like the sound of stone grinding against stone. Words were rationed as strictly as food. A Spartan boy learned to speak rarely, and when he spoke, to wound with precision. Laconism The art of saying much in few words was not philosophy, it was survival. To speak too long was to expose weakness. To remain silent was to command respect. The agoge was not merely a school of the body, it was an annihilation of self. The second lesson was pain. From dawn until dusk they wrestled, raced and fought. When one boy fell, the others stepped over him. No one helped the fallen, for to do so was to dishonor the lesson. Bruises and blood were badges of progress. The instructors carried switches of leather, and the whistling crack of punishment was a constant rhythm. To cry out was shame, to bleed without sound was pride. Even in ritual during the festival of Artemis Orthia, boys were whipped before the altar till their backs ran red, while the priests and mothers watched. They called it devotion. The gods demanded endurance, not pity. At night they were told stories, not of heroes who loved or kings who wept, but of Leonidas, who stood with 300 at Thermopylae, of Lycurgus, the lawgiver who had forbidden gold, music, and softness. Every tale ended with the same refrain: to die for Sparta is to live forever. The words sank into their bones like iron cooling in water. There were no toys, no songs, no games except those that prepared for war. They learned to move as one, to sleep light, to strike without hesitation. When they grew strong enough, they were sent into the hills to survive for days without food or fire, clothed only in rags, armed only with a knife. Those who returned were not praised, they were simply deemed ready for the next cruelty. Those who did not return were forgotten. A society that kills its weak does not build memorials for its lost. Yet within this machinery of obedience, something strange began to form. A bond beyond blood. The boys became brothers not through affection but through endurance. They learned to trust not the warmth of words but the certainty of silence. Their friendships were born not in laughter but in shared bruises and sleepless nights. In the darkness of the barracks they would whisper questions they could never ask aloud. Does pain ever end? Do the gods watch us? Will my mother remember my name? But no answer came, only the slow breathing of exhausted bodies and the weight of a city that had chosen them to be more than human. When they reached adolescence, the lessons grew harsher. They were encouraged to fight each other, not in sport, but in dominance. Every victory built hierarchy, every defeat carved humility. Those who showed compassion were mocked. Those who hesitated were beaten. Over time, kindness became an unfamiliar muscle, one they learned never to use. Among them, a few began to stand apart. Boys who seemed born for command, whose silence carried gravity, whose cruelty was clean and precise. They were marked for leadership, not because they desired it, but because they had learned the truest Spartan virtue, to suppress desire itself. By 18, a boy had become a shadow. His laughter had vanished, his tears had dried long ago. He could run 20 miles without water, sleep standing in armor, and kill with a single thrust. But beneath the hardened skin, a question still lingered, one they had been trained never to ask. What is all this strength for? The answer came not from their instructors, but from the rituals that followed. When the crops ripened and the helots, the enslaved farmers of Laconia, came to market, the young warriors were sent into the countryside. It was called the Cryptaia, the hidden war. They were told it was a rite of passage, a test of stealth and courage. But its true purpose was darker. Each young man was ordered to kill a helot under cover of night, to remind the enslaved population that fear was eternal. The state declared war on its own subjects once every year, not for conquest, but for control. Murder became governance, silence became order. And so the boys, now men, went out beneath the moonlight, barefoot, cloaked in black, their knives glinting like small stars. The first kill was clumsy, the second easier. By the third, it became routine. Their faces did not tremble, their eyes did not close. When they returned, no one spoke of what had been done. There were no celebrations, no songs, no guilt. Only a nod from the elder who greeted them at the gate. A silent acknowledgement that the forge had completed its work. The boys who had left their mothers years ago were gone. In their place stood soldiers, vessels of command, carved from silence, sharpened by obedience. Sparta had made its perfection. And yet, perfection is a fragile thing. Beneath the polished surface of discipline lay the emptiness of souls that had never been allowed to feel. They had been taught to conquer the body, but not to understand it, to master fear, but not to comprehend love. A people that learns to live without emotion soon forgets why it should live at all. The Agora was meant to build immortality, but immortality built upon cruelty is nothing more than stone pretending to be flesh. And when the stone finally cracks, it remembers every cry it once silenced. Morning broke over the red hills of Laconia, and the wind carried with it the echo of training cries from the fields below. Spears striking shields, boys shouting in unison, the rhythm of obedience. And from the high terraces above the Eurotas River, the women of Sparta watched, their faces calm, their postures regal, their hearts buried beneath the armor of expectation. They were not the soft wives of other lands nor the veiled ornaments of noble houses. They were Spartan women, the mothers of iron. From childhood, they had been shaped by the same creed that forged their sons. The state had taken their bodies as vessels and their spirits as weapons. They were not permitted to weep for the fallen, for grief was weakness, and weakness was treason. Even as little girls, they had been trained beneath the same burning sun as the boys, running, wrestling, throwing the discus, learning to bear pain with silence and to see beauty in strength. A woman who cannot command her body, the instructors would say, cannot command her womb. Their exercises were not for vanity, but for duty, for the perfection of the flesh that would one day carry the future of the city. And so they grew, tall, athletic, proud, taught to see childbirth as battle and endurance as faith. While the rest of Greece mocked them as shameless for training half-naked, they did not flinch. They were told that shame was a foreign disease and that modesty was for those who lacked power. Their beauty was not decoration. It was a weapon of the state, a sign that Sparta's women could rival her men in the art of discipline. Marriage in Sparta was not a ceremony of affection, it was an act of breeding. When a woman reached maturity, she was selected not for love, but for lineage. The match was chosen with the precision of a blacksmith fitting a blade. Strength met strength, not heart to heart, but bone to bone. The wedding was no celebration. It was a ritual abduction. At night, the groom would steal his bride from her home, as tradition demanded. She would be shaved of her hair to resemble a boy and dressed in a man's cloak. Then, in darkness, the two would meet for the first time, their union brief, their intimacy secret. Afterward, he would leave her in silence, returning to the barracks before dawn. For years, they might see each other only in stolen moments, arranged by whispers and shadows. The state had decreed it so. Love, they believed, distracted the warrior. Attachment softened resolve. Marriage was not for companionship, but for continuity. A duty, not a desire. The men belonged to the agoj, the barracks, the phalanx. The women belonged to the hearth, the fields, and the cradle, not as caretakers, but as the stewards of Sparta's future flesh. And yet, beneath this machinery of function, something fierce burned in them, not tenderness, but defiance. Spartan women were the only in Greece who could inherit land, who could speak freely before men, who could command slaves and estates. While their husbands trained or died, it was they who ruled the oikos, who maintained the farms, who negotiated trade, who raised the next generation of soldiers. They were, in truth, the unseen backbone of the empire, the ones who kept the machine alive when all others had gone to war. But their authority came at a cost. Their worth was measured not by virtue or intellect, but by the strength of the sons they bore. A barren woman was a tragedy, a mother of cowards, an abomination. When the men marched to battle, the women stood at the city gates, their faces carved from stone. If a wife wept as her husband departed, she would be mocked as unfit to live among Spartans. If she rejoiced in his death, saying, "He died well," she was honored as noble. There is a story told by Plutarch of one mother who was handed her son's corpse after a battle. The soldier's armor had been lost in retreat, and when she saw him, she spat upon his body and said, "You should have returned with your shield, not without it." Then she turned and walked away. The people praised her as the ideal of Spartan motherhood. The poets later called her monstrous. But in truth, she was neither. She was what her world demanded, the living altar of a god that worshipped strength above love. Still, not all women accepted that creed in silence. Some broke beneath it, others quietly rebelled. There are fragments, whispers, preserved in letters and in the gossip of travelers of Spartan wives who refused to remarry after the death of their husbands, or who sheltered their sons when the state demanded they return to training too soon. One, unnamed in the records, was said to have fled the city entirely, carrying her infant across the Taygetus mountains into the lands of the Helots. None know if she survived. But the story lingered, a small fracture in the marble facade of Spartan perfection. The most haunting truth of these women was this: they believed. They believed utterly. They had been raised to see their bodies as sacred instruments, their pain as a contribution to eternity. When their sons left for war, they stood in silence, knowing that most would not return. They prayed not for safety, but for glory. For in Sparta, a man who died in battle was promised immortality. A man who lived in cowardice was erased from memory. And when news came that an army had fallen, the mothers would gather in the square, not to wail, but to count the names, to see if their sons had died well. Only the mothers of the living wept, for their sons had been denied the honor of death. The philosopher Aristoteles once wrote that Sparta's women ruled the men through the fear of shame. It was true. The greatest power a Spartan woman possessed was not her voice, but her silence, a silence so heavy it could crush a man's hesitation. For no soldier wanted to return to the gaze of his mother if he had failed to uphold her pride. Over time, that silence became the heartbeat of the city, strong, steady, merciless. It echoed through every home, every training ground, every funeral. The women's endurance made Sparta immortal, even as it drained them of softness. They were not poets or philosophers, they were the architects of sacrifice. But in the centuries that followed, when Sparta began to crumble under the weight of its own perfection, it was the women who remained. Long after the warriors had fallen and the laws of Lycurgus were dust, the mothers of iron still walked the hills of Laconia, their strength outlasting the empire that had demanded it. They had given everything, womb, son, husband, heart, to the altar of discipline. And though the marble statues would later show them as proud and unyielding, the truth whispered differently through time. The gods themselves, it was said, envied the Spartan women, not for their power but for their endurance, because they alone had learned the deepest law of all, that to survive in a world that worships strength, a woman must learn to make her own heart as hard as the shields she sends to war. And beneath the weight of that strength, she must still remember how to breathe. Night fell over Laconia like a sheet of iron. The hills that surrounded Sparta glowed faintly with the embers of hearth fires, and far below, the fields stretched into the blackness. Quiet, disciplined, cultivated by the enslaved helots who kept the empire alive. Their songs rose in whispers across the land, old hymns of the conquered, sung softly so as not to wake the masters who dreamed of war. The Spartans called them servants. The truth was simpler. They were prisoners born into chains. Every harvest, every loaf of bread, every weapon forged by the blacksmith's hands came from helot labor. They were the unseen backbone of Sparta's glory, the people who fed those who would never feed themselves. For every Spartan warrior, there were 7 helots tilling the soil, bending their backs under the same sun, breathing the same dust. And yet, between them stood a gulf that no bridge could cross. The Spartans lived in fear of their own foundation. They knew that the helots outnumbered them. They knew that every grain of wheat was bought with resentment. So they built a system not of peace, but of terror, a weapon sharper than any spear. It was called the crypteia. It began as a ritual, whispered into being by the elders, sanctified by the laws of Lycurgus himself. Each autumn, when the leaves began to fall, the ephors, Sparta's 5 high magistrates, would gather before the temple of Apollo. There, in solemn ceremony, they would declare war upon the helots. It was not metaphor, it was law. For 1 full year, the killing of helots was not murder, but civic duty. In the darkness that followed, the chosen youths of Sparta, those who had survived the forge of the Agogsh, were sent into the hills. They carried no armor, no torches, only knives and hunger. Their task was simple: to stalk the night, to observe and to kill. They targeted the boldest among the helots, the strongest, the ones who spoke too loudly or gathered too many around the fire. Strength, in Sparta's logic, belonged only to the citizen. In slaves, it was rebellion. And so the young men learned a new kind of warfare, the war against the unarmed. They crawled through the reeds and the olive groves, watching the shadows of those who bent to harvest the earth. They struck from behind, silently, efficiently, leaving bodies that the dawn would discover like broken offerings. The goal was not numbers, it was fear. Each death was a message carved into the hearts of the living. There was no honor in it, but there was discipline. The state had turned cruelty into training, morality into obedience. To question was weakness, to hesitate was failure. Those who returned alive were praised not for bravery, but for silence. A man who spoke of what he had done was unworthy of the name Spartan. And so the cycle continued, year after year, generation after generation. An invisible war between the masters and the enslaved, fought in whispers and shadows. The helots learned to hide their defiance in laughter, to bow lower when the patrols passed, to bury their anger beneath the rhythm of their labor. But rebellion has a memory. And the earth, which drank their blood, began to remember too. Historians speak of the great helot revolts that followed, the uprisings that shook even Sparta's iron discipline. After the great earthquake of 464 BCE, when the ground itself split beneath the city, the helots rose in arms, believing the gods had finally answered their prayers. For 10 years, they fought from the fortress of Ithome, holding off the soldiers who had been trained since birth to break them. 10 years of hunger, fear, and resistance. 10 years that exposed the fragility beneath Sparta's perfection. In that decade, the cry of the helot became something sacred. Mothers sang to their children not of gods or heroes, but of freedom, a word that could get them killed, yet still tasted sweet in the mouth. And when the Spartans finally crushed the revolt, the silence that followed was not victory, it was exhaustion. The city had won, but it had lost something it could never name, a piece of its soul worn away by the blood it had spilled to keep its order intact. The crypteia did not end, it evolved. The young men continued their secret hunts, even when the world beyond Sparta began to change, when Athens wrote its plays, when philosophers spoke of justice, when empires rose and fell. Sparta remained the same, frozen in its own mythology, feeding on the fear it had created. And yet, within its walls, unease began to grow. Some of the elders' men who had once stalked the night themselves started to question whether the system had purified or poisoned them. One, named Doricles, left a fragment of writing later found by a Roman traveler. It read, "We have trained ourselves to see in darkness, but we no longer see the light." That line, barely surviving in the dust of centuries, captures the truth of the silent war. The Spartans believed they were keeping their world pure by keeping others in terror. But in doing so, they became prisoners of their own creation, bound by the same chains they had forged for the helots. The young warriors returned from their hunts more hollow than before. They did not speak of what they had done, but their silence carried weight. Some refused to marry, claiming that no new life should be born into such a world. Others became cruel even to their own, finding release only in domination. A few, haunted beyond redemption, walked into the mountains and never returned. The records call them deserters. The poets, centuries later, called them ghosts. The crypteia remained Sparta's most sacred secret, but secrets rot. They corrode the soul like rust upon bronze. And when the wars against Athens came, when Sparta's soldiers met their enemies on the open field, many found that they no longer fought for glory, only habit. The discipline remained, but the fire was gone. A soldier who kills in darkness cannot always remember how to fight in light. Still, the myth endured. Even as the world outside changed, the name Spartan came to mean endurance, austerity, courage. But beneath that word, buried like a bone beneath stone, lies this truth, that their courage was built on fear, their order on blood, their pride on silence. The crypteia was not just an act of control, it was the mirror of Sparta's soul. Cold, efficient, afraid of what it might see if it stopped moving long enough to feel. And as the centuries passed, the olive trees grew over the graves, the wind softened, and the hills forgot the footsteps of the hunters. But some nights, when the moon is high and the valley is still, the locals say you can hear something faint between the rustle of leaves. Not screams, not words, just a slow, rhythmic breathing. The sound of men who believed they were perfect, hiding from the shadows they themselves had created. For in the end, every empire that builds its strength upon fear must one day face the silence it left behind. And in that silence, even the strongest learn what they feared most, that power without mercy is not strength, but surrender to the dark. Time is merciless, even to those who worship strength. Centuries turned like slow millstones, grinding the marble ideals of Sparta into dust. The city that once claimed to have no walls because its warriors were its walls now found itself enclosed, not by stone, but by memory, by myth, by the unrelenting echo of its own perfection. By the 4th century before Christ, the once invincible phalanx was a shadow of what it had been. The iron discipline that had defined Sparta's heart began to rust from within. It did not collapse in flames or conquest at first, no. Sparta decayed in silence, the way all rigid things do. Like a statue too finely carved, one crack at the base, one tremor of the earth, and the illusion of eternity begins to crumble. They say the beginning of the end came at Leuctra, 371 BCE, a green plain under a pale sky, where Thebes waited like a patient predator. For the first time, Sparta faced an enemy that did not tremble at its name. The Thebans fought not as men terrified of gods, but as men who believed they could kill them. And on that field, the unthinkable happened. The Spartan line, perfect, geometrical, divine, broke. The ground of Leuctra drank the blood of 600 Spartiates that day, and with it, the soul of the empire. What centuries of Helot revolts, Persian gold and internal decay could not do, a single morning of human vulnerability accomplished. The invincible had been made mortal. When the survivors returned, they found a city that no longer recognized itself. The boys who had been raised to believe that death was preferable to defeat were now men forced to live with both. There were no songs written for the survivors of Leuctra, only silence. A silence that stretched through the agora, through the barracks, through the once proud halls of the Gerousia. The women, the same women who had been trained from childhood to tell their sons, "Return with your shield," or on it, wept behind closed doors. Their tears were not just for the dead, but for the breaking of a lie. For centuries, they had believed that Spartan blood was incorruptible, that the law of Lycurgus was divine. But divinity had bled in the dust like any other man. It was then that the cracks widened. Wealth, once forbidden, seeped in through the fissures. Land ownership became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Of the tens of thousands of citizens who had once formed the backbone of the state, fewer than 1,000 remained. The rest had been lost in war, in poverty, in the unrelenting arithmetic of eugenics. The law of blood, once the foundation of Sparta's strength, now became its curse. The rigid breeding system, meant to produce only the strongest, had strangled the population. Marriages grew rarer, women, now controlling vast estates due to the deaths of their male kin, held power unseen before. And yet, the city was dying. Sparta had bred itself into extinction. The agorge continued, but its tone shifted. The boys still learned to fight, to endure, to obey. But they did so without the faith that once animated their fathers. The rituals persisted, but hollowly, like prayers recited by those who no longer believe. The crack of the whip during training sounded less like discipline now, more like desperation. The sound of a system clinging to its myth as it drowned beneath it. Outside, the world moved on. Athens flourished again in art and thought. The Thebans built new alliances. Macedon rose in the north, a storm gathering under the young Alexander, whose soldiers would one day march farther than any Spartan could dream. But Sparta, proud and unbending, remained still, a ghost city whose heartbeat had slowed to the rhythm of memory. The philosopher Aristotle would later write that Sparta had remained great for as long as it was at war, but once peace came, it perished. He was right, though not in the way he intended. Sparta was never designed to live in peace. Its entire structure, its laws, its morality, its education, existed only for conflict. War was not merely its purpose, it was its oxygen. When war ended, the city suffocated. In the centuries that followed, travelers came to see what was left. The ruins still stood, austere and sun-bleached, scattered across the Taygetus Valley like bones. Roman historians walked among them and spoke of a greatness lost to time. "Here once were men," one wrote, "who believed themselves gods, but the gods they had built were brittle, and even marble shatters when it forgets to bend." The descendants of the Helots, now free under shifting regimes, worked the same fields, grew the same olives, whispered the same prayers to older gods. The irony was not lost on them. The empire that had enslaved them had vanished, but their children remained living, laughing, growing. Life had triumphed where perfection had perished. By the time of the Romans, Sparta had become more theatre than state. Tourists from across the empire came to watch reenactments of the Agog boys whipped in public, their cries offered as a spectacle to those who wanted to glimpse the ghost of ancient cruelty. The rituals of discipline survived only as entertainment, stripped of meaning. The city had become a museum of its own myth. And yet, even in ruin, Sparta held a strange kind of power. The idea of it, pure, disciplined, incorruptible, haunted empires long after its fall. Rome admired it. Renaissance princes studied it. Modern dictators envied it. Across time, the name Sparta became shorthand for control, for unity, for the terrifying beauty of total order. But those who invoked it never remembered the cost. The abandoned infants, the broken mothers, the boys who learned to kill before they learned to dream. History, when stripped of myth, is never clean. Beneath every statue lies a scar, beneath every victory, a grave. Sparta was no exception. It was the perfection that devoured itself, a civilization so obsessed with purity that it consumed its own humanity. And yet perhaps there is still something to be learned from its ashes, that no system built on fear can endure, that no state that turns love into policy or birth into obedience can outlive its own cruelty. That power without compassion is the surest path to death. As the last of the Spartan kings faded into obscurity, the ruins of their city became silent once more. The wind carried the scent of thyme and salt from the sea. Somewhere, a shepherd's voice echoed through the hills, a sound of life, not discipline, a sound Sparta could never understand. And the earth, ever patient, reclaimed the stones, the same soil that had once been soaked with the blood of the strong, now nourished wildflowers, red and gold, blooming in the spring sun. The perfection that Sparta sought was always here, waiting, not in the forging of men into weapons, but in the quiet resilience of the human spirit, which outlasts every empire that tries to control it. In the end, all that remains of Sparta is a whisper carried by history. Strength without mercy is ruin. Discipline without heart is slavery. And perfection is the slowest form of death.